for coming. I'm Kris Darrah, and I am in my 14th year at the Classical School of Wichita, and the 14th year of swimming through the waters of the Progymnasmata. So I was at first just handed, I'm going to grab this textbook over here. 14 years ago, there was no curriculum for teaching the Progymnasmata, so another teacher and I were just handed this college textbook with the 14 exercises in it. Teach this to all of our upper school students. So that was my first impression was, wow, this is a lot. And I wasn't a huge fan at first. I came from teaching in the public school system where everything was very loose, like just write at your own pace. Everybody's an individual. Write whatever you'd like to write about. And this is very structured. So it took me a while to get used to it. But now I've really learned to see its value and come to appreciate it a lot, and would just encourage it to be used as much as possible in our classrooms. This is really exciting for me just to get together and collaborate. I would like this to kind of be a discussion session to bounce ideas off each other, because there's so much you can do with the Progymnasmata. So I'd like to kind of go over an overview, but then share thoughts and ideas. And I even included on the back page just some space for writing notes over each exercise if ideas come to mind as we're talking, that you could just jot down some thoughts there. I just don't get the opportunity to do this very often, so it is fun. This past summer, I had a chance to meet with Eileen Cunningham, who wrote our curriculum, which I do have displayed here. She's a former teacher from our school, and she's revising some of her books. So we got together and discussed some ideas over some things, and I got home, and my husband asked the obligatory, "How was your day?" And I said, "It was so much fun." He's like, "Oh, I thought you had that classical composition meeting." I said, "I did." He said, "Oh, so you didn't go?" "Yes, I did. That's why it was fun." So that concept was lost on him. But to me, this is what I do every day. This is what I'm passionate about, and trying to get students engaged in these exercises and excited, and for them to embrace them. So I just want to have a chance to talk together today and see what works and what doesn't, and how we can become better classical composition educators. So just to get an idea of how many of you are already using the program in your classrooms? Nobody? A couple of people. So how many of you know that it's used at your school and taught at your school, but you're not currently using it? And then some people, it's just not taught at your school at all yet? Okay. All right, so we have the wide range of the wide spectrum of people, and that's great. So just a little plug for why to teach the program. First of all, it's classical. This is what the ancient Greeks used, and they were masters of rhetoric. So we should imitate that. We know that they didn't just suddenly become masters of rhetoric, but they were trained from an early age. And so we can do that. We can use these building blocks to train our students to become excellent speakers and writers also. Another thing, from even an unclassical point of view or a non-classical point of view, it's a great system of writing. It encompasses every type of writing that a person would need to use in their lives. It covers expository, descriptive, narrative, comparative, persuasive. It's all in there. And so it's just a very effective way of teaching writing and giving students structures and tools that they can use in their larger pieces of writing, like their thesis papers. And even, for example, I had the opportunity to introduce our graduation speaker last year. There was the encomium right there. Like, I could just follow that structure, and I had ideas of what I could use, and it wasn't just an unorganized mess of blabbering. Like, there was some sense to it. So the best aspect, my favorite part of the program, is that every exercise is engineered to point to godly behavior. So the ancient Greeks used each exercise to promote moral behavior. They wanted to create citizens who were courageous and honorable and diligent. And so, they wanted a strong society. So they promoted those things in every piece of writing that they did. And so we just take that a little step further, fits perfectly. We just promote biblical principles and godly character, and each exercise it works perfectly to do that. So that's my favorite thing about the program. And in almost every piece of writing that my students do, I require them to give biblical support, because the opportunity is right there to do that. So what is the Progymnasmata? It's a series of 14 writing exercises. They increase in difficulty level from simple to more advanced. There are some that definitely need to be placed more at early levels, but there's no hard and fast rule to the order. There are definitely some that require upper level thinking, so we would use them towards the end of a student's schooling. The pronunciation, I know some people say progym or progymnasmata, and so this is just one thing I thought I'd quickly touch on. The Eileen Cunningham, the teacher who wrote our curriculum, did a lot of research before she wrote her book into the pronunciation, and she came up with progym. So that's how we've been saying it. I don't know which one is correct. I may say potato, you can say potato, and it's okay. So what I'd like to do is just go through each exercise and talk about the definition and the purpose of each exercise, and then throw out ideas, some things that we do, some thoughts that you have. I would love to hear. So the Fable is definitely an exercise to use with younger students. You can read fables obviously as early as kindergarten, and it's perfect because they're short. They use animals who look and act and talk like people, and there's always a little lesson to be learned. And who doesn't love the fact that that diligent tortoise beat that lazy hare in the end? So it's just something that appeals to young students for sure. And then you can always apply it to biblical principles, like you can pull out Proverbs that apply, that fit with the moral lesson of the fable, or other verses. Go ahead.
Do you ask them to actually write a fable, or is it mostly just reading and talking about a fable?
So both. Younger ages, it's more of that sort of thing. And then in 4th grade, we actually teach the fable all year long. They're instructed on writing fables, rewriting fables, expanding them with description and dialogue. And then the older they get, students can take higher level concepts and apply them to fables. So you can take, Animal Farm is a fable, right? It's a warning against the dangers of communism, and it's basically a fable. So in 8th grade, our students write medieval fables. They look at medieval fables and write them, and they're a little bit longer, and they have these horrific consequences, like Reynard the Fox ends up tearing the bear limb from limb, and it's pretty graphic, but the 8th grade boys and even girls really kind of get into that and want to see these characters suffer for these failures that they have. So we do that with our 8th graders. Students can take economic systems or theological ideas. I've had my students write a fable over a scientific theory, and so this year I thought I'd just read one of my 8th graders came up with. One day, Joe the cow was strolling across his farm and discovered a new pool. As a cow, he knew he was not allowed to be in a pool. He was super hot and wanted to swim. He knew that he would be slaughtered if he was caught, so he came up with a plan to get into the pool. When he had finished preparing, he jumped in. What he didn't know was that when you jump in the water, you displace the amount of water you weigh. He failed to calculate the buoyant force by factoring in the density of the water and the gravitational acceleration. He did not displace enough water. He was now stuck in the pool. Let's just say Farmer Jim and his family ate very well that night. Moral, plan out your plans carefully. So, even in science, I'm sure art, you could, maybe take some concept and apply it to fable writing. What do you think? Now I'm opening it up. What have you used, or what ideas are popping into your mind of ways that you could incorporate a fable? Any thoughts? How many of you read or rewrite fables currently? Just read them. So one technique you can use is just to, well, depending on the age of your students, rewrite them, adding description and dialogue. So we'll move on to the narrative because we have 13 more exercises to get through. So the narrative, a story written with a specific purpose or theme that can be written for many purposes: to inform, to persuade, to entertain. I think it's super important that younger grades start out learning the elements of a narrative, and that's being discussed as you're reading your literature, just taking the simple elements and bringing them out: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Okay, who are the characters in the story? Let's talk about the main characters and then the secondary characters. Okay, when did it happen? Where did it happen? It may not seem like an important thing to cover in younger grades, but a few years back, before we covered the narrative earlier, I would ask my sixth graders, so what's important in a narrative? What do you have to have a story? A simile? Well, you know, that's nice to have in a story, but it's not a requirement. Periods? Well, yeah, you have to have good grammar, but what if it's a story that's read? They could not even tell me the elements that were required to make up a story. The fact that it has to have a plot, there's always a conflict. It develops to a climax and then is resolved in the end. So just to be discussing that with younger students and realizing that it always has to take place somewhere and sometime, that's required for a narrative. So we actually in 5th grade really work on the writing of a narrative, and that's where we get really consistent with looking at those elements. Older grades can look at different genres. So our 7th graders, since they're studying ancient literature, write mythical narratives. They've been reading the Odyssey and some of these Greek myths, and so they form their own mythical narrative. 8th graders, I've had them write mysteries before, or 9th graders, as they're studying Edgar Allan Poe and some modern authors. Science fiction. In this, Eileen Cunningham, this teacher who's writing our curriculum, is working on a 9th grade book, and she's going to work on the different types of conflict that take place. Man versus man versus machine, man versus nature, man versus God, and really developing conflict. So there's just so much you can do with the narrative as students get older. So thoughts on narrative? Is anybody doing any narrative writing currently, or?
One of the things I use narrative for is understanding the difference between cause and effect and just like antecedents, I guess, or cause and effect, and things that just happen to take place before something else happened. So when I talk about narrative with 8th grade and with 9th grade, I tell them a narrative is a believable string of cause and effect, depending on the world that you've created, right? Like believable within the context of the story itself, but it's actually cause and effect. It's not just a list of
It's not just
things
randomly
that are
happening.
It's actually this thing is leading to the next thing. And so sometimes what I'll have them actually do is start from the end. What's the last thing that happened? So I mean, we'll do this whenever we're looking at stories, but I tell them I need to be able to do this with your stories also, but I have them start at the last thing, and then, okay, well, what got us here directly? What was the action right before this that got us here? And they
then you can go back.
Backwards
Okay.
timeline, and that's
I like that.
helpful.
Very helpful, just to get that train of thinking going.
Yeah.
And realizing things aren't just happening randomly. There's a process to
Right.
the order of things. That's good. Anybody else? You can take characters from books that you're currently reading and have them set out the who, what, when, where, why, how, and come up with their own stories. There's just a lot that you can do with that, and like our classical way books just kind of lead right into that. If that's something you want to take more of a look at.
What I love about this exercise is the creative aspect of it, which is, I think, something that our
Absolutely.
students, modern students, really need. You were talking about earlier how they couldn't give you the elements of the narrative. Well, there you are, right? They have to think about it. They have to create their own story. I think they're not as imaginative as they used to be because of a number of reasons. So I think it's a great exercise to make them create something. And
Right.
I'm sure they love it, right?
Yes, and starting with just imitating, taking short stories and expanding on them, using descriptive techniques or different techniques, but then beginning to write their own by imitation. Like this year, our sixth graders Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. So we read several of those, and then they knew kind of the general outline of the story, and then used that to creatively come up with their own way of how an animal got to be the way it is today. And so, yes, kind of gradually adding more elements of creativity until they're basically able to form their own characters, plot, setting, and furthermore. So.
Seems you could intertwine a biblical narrative as well.
Yes, yes, and that's where you do have to be somewhat careful so that you're not rewriting scripture if you don't want to expand on.
Absolutely.
But examining narratives from scripture and seeing, we have done that quite a bit. Like, okay, here's the story of the prodigal son. Let's look at the elements. Let's pull them out. Let's analyze that. So, really good point. So the description is next, I think, yes. And Selby, who wrote this composition in the classical tradition, has description a little bit later. But we like to put it a little bit earlier because very young students can begin describing things, and as soon as they're learning the parts of speech especially, they can pull out adjectives and adverbs and different descriptive words from literature. So early grades, just bringing out that discussion. So what do you think Mr. McGregor's garden looked like, smelled like, sounded like, tasted like? Starting to use those senses to describe, and just formulating those questions as you're reading literature in kindergarten, first, second grade is so helpful as they learn to describe later on. And then by the time we get to 5th and 6th grade and we're reading Dickens and Call of the Wild and the description is so vivid, then we're really able to analyze that and pull out words that they think are really strong and effective, and even keep lists of strong adjectives and adverbs that then they can use in their own writing. And just always to be discussing that is so important. In the middle grades, with this curriculum, we start to learn specifically, how do you describe an object? Well, you can talk about its color, size, shape, its age, its texture, its material, its other attributes. And they kind of learn, they memorize those approaches and those ways to describe, and then they can use those as they begin to write. They learn how to describe people. They learn how to describe places. And then in 7th, we learn how to describe time, the passage of time. We learn how to describe action. And in 8th grade, these books cover describing someone's perception of something, someone who's in an unfamiliar setting and how they would perceive something. And so it just gets a little more challenging as you go, but there are a lot of ways that you can teach that. A little plug for Eileen's trope trafficking book. So she has a book. All of these are available on Amazon, but different figures of description. So anastrophe, antinoclassis, anthemaria, alliteration, onomatopoeia, using some of those techniques in your writing, more advanced techniques with the older students. So thoughts and ideas on description?
I think this one applies probably the most to what I do. And I've just been sitting here thinking about how can I incorporate it or mesh it with the rest of the curriculum. So I don't know. I mean, linking it with Omnibus, you could probably do some things with describing pieces of artwork and stuff like that. So it's got me thinking about that. But as far as like
Absolutely.
specifics right now, I don't know. I'm just putting that
Just the
together.
early stages of brainstorming
Yeah.
that. I think that'd be great to incorporate with art. Taking a look at a piece of art and analyzing it and describing it. Any other thoughts on description, or is there something that you already do in your classrooms to pull out descriptive words, or any thoughts on that? We can move on along. The proverb Crea, and I know there's another workshop where Janie Carey will be taking the proverb Crea and the refutation and confirmation in depth, so I maybe won't spend as long on this one, but this to me is a little bit of an upper level piece of writing. It's taking either a proverb, which is a short saying that gives advice, or a Crea, which is maybe a longer quotation, someone that you can attribute that quote to someone, and they're written to encourage moral behavior. So taking Bible verses, whether they're proverbs or not, and expanding on them. And there are 9 steps that we go through to really show why that saying is worth listening to. So how do you do this with younger children? Be looking at sentences or phrases that stand out in the books that you're reading, these wise thoughts that pop out and that are meaningful, either to you or to your students, and really bringing those out. Praising the author of the saying, having them put it in their own words. It's more of an upper level skill, but something that is super important and young children can start to do. You know, what's another word for this? Can you think of a synonym, you know, as you're using synonyms? Could you find 3 words in this sentence where you could use a synonym and rephrase this? Explain why it's wise. Why was it said? What's the opposite of this saying? Can you compare it to something else? These are kind of upper level skills as you draw analogies. And then, is there somebody else who said something similar? Especially looking at scripture. Well, what would the Bible say about this? Is there a verse that would match this, that would say a similar, give a similar theme? And I just gave a short example of how each one of those can be written out. Obviously, those paragraphs can be a lot more developed the older the student. But yeah, can you think of any sayings that stand out in the literature that you're reading, or I don't know, just give it some thought and pawn it over, but be thinking as you're reading, okay, what are some wise sayings that stand out?
I can see this being helpful because, you know, many times in what we're reading or writing, we just mull over a bunch of things and then we don't take time to really think through what that actually meant. So I can see the students really benefiting from this because it's taking it from dialectic to a rhetoric. They have to regurgitate, for lack of a better word, you know, they have to put it in their own words, so that's very helpful in learning what that actually means and not just brushing over and going on.
Yes, really helps them dig deeper into the meaning of the saying. It definitely really helps them analyze it from every angle and get a good perspective. All right, next on the list is the Encomium and the Invective. So an encomium is praising usually a person. You could also praise an event, an idea, a thing, but it's usually the praise of a person. And then an invective is the opposite. We condemn a person for their evil deeds and their vices. So once again, really instilling in students the ability to, in what they're reading and what they're studying, who are we looking at? Which type of people exhibit godly characters? Okay, which are the people that do not? And which are the characters that are showing evil characteristics and evil deeds. And so these follow 5 steps. You have the background, and their education and influences is the way that both exercises begin. I think it's super important to look at how a person was influenced. We talk a lot about that. What influences you today? What do you, the things that you're looking at, what do you measure them against? Are you looking at Scripture and analyzing your influences, your heroes, whoever you idolize? Are you comparing them to godly characters and biblical behavior? So we really look at that. And then for an encomium, looking at the character traits, so the adjectives, the strong, good characteristics that describe the person, and then the achievements, things that they've achieved that are noteworthy, and ending with comparing that character to somebody else, which is where it's kind of fun to look at maybe Bible characters or other influential people throughout history that would compare. So lots of examples from any subject. I mean, look how Frog was helping Toad. Look how Robin Hood is helping the poor. Some of his character traits could easily come out. I don't know. Who can you think of in your literature that would be praiseworthy?
I teach science, so we'll sometimes look at the bio of a scientist. And so
Oh, perfect.
Einstein
Perfect.
has a very interesting past. And it was interesting to ask students, well, what virtues is he reflecting in this? What type of virtues is he reflecting in his personal life compared to his work life? And so
Wow.
It was kind of eye-opening to the students what kind of life Einstein actually led. And so it makes it a really interesting conversation for sure.
Love it. Love it. Who else can you think of? Any characters that stand out? Or
I think the one that you said, Robin Hood, I think is an interesting one, because you could probably have a class try doing an encomium and also have them do an invective.
I wonder if
Could
that's
you
been
just-
done before.
Sounds really smart. But I think the encomium and invective is kind of where you start getting into the forms where it's not just like, can you do this, but should you do this? Because I could probably ask a class to just follow this form and plug stuff in and do an invective on the Apostle Paul. But should they do an invective on the Apostle Paul? They could follow this form and just plug stuff in and do an invective. But now is where they're starting to have to make the decision of, okay, just because which this is a conversation we have about the rhetoric phase, right? Now, just because you can convince somebody of something, does that make it right for you to do it? And so they're starting to have to make that decision. I can have you do an invective on Mickey Mouse. Should you do it? That one's lower stakes, I guess. But it's that kind of, then you start to get into what it says on the front of the packet, this is moral development for us, godly development.
Yes. Really good point. Yeah, my 8th graders this year just had become kind of aware that the custodian of our school was he just has a way of going out of his way to be nice to the students. They decided they wanted to write an encomium over Mr. Mike, and so hopefully we'll be reading that at Convocation sometime soon. But just that they're looking for those godly people around them, and I thought that was kind of neat that occurred to them. Hey, we should write an encomium over him. He's somebody that we would want to follow as an example. So, and then just to touch on the invective briefly, can you think of a villain that you read about or study about, or somebody who, there's always the obvious go-tos like Hitler and, but who can you see in that's maybe not as villainous, but as you said, like somebody who we could and should be aware that we don't want to follow those characteristics. Like we wrote an invective, our sixth graders, over Scrooge this year. We also just wrote one over Napoleon from Animal Farm, looking at how, his evil deeds just gradually transpire throughout the book, and he becomes more and more evil, and often because of his influences. So, yeah.
It doesn't even have to be someone who actually existed or even from the Bible.
No.
It could be the
Absolutely.
greedy person or whatever. Like somebody with a major defect.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's interesting. Could you almost like reverse this to create a character? Like, just going off like what he just said, I'm just wondering if you...
I could see that you could follow the parts. You might have to kind of make up some things, but that would be fun. Like their background, what influenced them to develop those character traits.
Yeah.
I like that idea. I really like that idea.
Seems like this would be good for students who are struggling in their faith too,
Oh.
to be able to see the effects of sin in someone's life and what it leads to.
Like self-evaluation.
Self-evaluation for sure. Very good point. Moving on to the comparison. So this one's pretty short and sweet. The comparison sounds like it might just center around similarities, but it also involves contrast. So you're taking two things and showing the similarities and differences between the two things, and you can take anything from sports to Bible characters, family members, different theological concepts. You can compare Calvinism and Arminianism. You can compare views of eschatology. We've done that before. Different narratives, different stories. The early church and the church today. I mean, really, you can take about anything that you're studying and think of something to compare it to. So this might work in art too.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, comparing two pieces.
So there are two ways that you can compare things. You can go point by point, so talk about both things and give a point about each, or you can use block comparison where you give all the points about one thing and then all the points about the other. So.
And then are you, at the end of that paragraph, are you determining which one is better?
You could make some judgments on, yes. Definitely, I think you could do that. One thing that our seventh graders do, they compared the Code of Hammurabi to the Old Testament law. And I think they studied the code and didn't think much of it, like, okay, here were these rules by this old ancient king. But when they looked at how similar they were to the Old Testament law and punishments, okay, there are a lot of similarities there. But how are they different? One set of laws offers no hope. It's a dead end. It's you're punished and you die. Then you have this set of laws where they're pointing toward Christ, and there's repentance and there's hope. So definitely, I think drawing those conclusions from your comparisons would be necessary. Thoughts on comparison? You probably do some of that already in your discussion.
This would be an easy way to go deeper and get them really thinking. Like we just did Brown versus Board of Education, and they all understand that it was not fair, schools were not fair, they weren't equal, and they get this emotional feeling, but if they had to write about it and really compare step by step what was different, what was the same, and get to the root, it might help.
The root, like the heart
process
issue
some
of it.
Those heart issues and get a little bit deeper, besides just,
Right.
oh yeah, that wasn't.
Right. That's what it does. It allows you to go deeper on that. The next one is my favorite. The speech and character definitely allows for a lot of creativity. It's basically a monologue by obviously one character, and it reveals that character's emotions, and it really just shows universal themes about humanity, We all have struggles. We all have battles. What characters, or what books and what characters would you see that playing out? It doesn't have to be long, but it just shows a character processing his or her emotions over something. And it could be Odysseus longing for home, or Juliet lamenting that the one she loves is hated by her family, or a passenger on the Mayflower mourning the death of the loved ones around him or her and wondering what this new life will be like. So it begins with, basically there are 3 parts. It begins with the present problem. So you have this situation and this problem that this character is in. Then it goes into the past, how the problem developed, and then the future, what the person will do about the problem. So not what happens as a result, but just what this person, through their processing of their conflict, intends to do. You can take an indefinite person, so you could take a character like a goldfish in a bowl. You could take a soldier going off to war, or a pioneer facing hardships on the plains. You could just kind of have a general scenario from a book that you're reading, or a time period that you're studying history, and choose a character and kind of have a student process what emotions that person would be feeling. Or you could take a definite person, the Velveteen Rabbit when he's thrown into a sack, or Cleopatra learning that Mark Antony is dead. Or in Animal Farm, I had the 6th graders choose an animal on the farm, and they had to write from that animal's perspective what it was like as they gradually became brainwashed and gradually watched the corruption happen. And so I think it really helps the student empathize and kind of delve into what we go through as Christians, the battles that take place in our heart. And I've had teachers tell me, well, younger students can't do that because they're not at the stage where they can empathize yet. But I also had a 6th grader tell me last year, I had them write from a point of view of a Jew during the Holocaust, living in Germany, and I had a student say, Mrs. Darrah, I was crying when I wrote this because I felt what it was like to be this poor girl who was hated by everyone and had to hide. So I think it's good for students of any age to try to put themselves into a character's point of view and understand those struggles that we all can relate to. I thought I'd just read one from our Animal Farm selection, and it's not by any means the best writing, but I thought this person did a good job of getting into character. Hi, my name is Roberta the cow. Them pigs has been taking my milk. It's my milk. They has been drinking it too, and I is hungry. They don't give me enough grass. Right from the start, them pigs are up to something. They is stealing the milk and windfall apples. But I didn't care because I had enough grass. As the pigs kept on stealing, no one noticed. But I is knowing what they is up to now. Them piggy pigs are tyrants. I bet they weren't treating other animals equal. I have to do something. I'm starving. I'm as hungry as a dog. I have to see if they've changed a commandment. Where's Clover? I can't read. So this person, I really wanted them to take on the intelligence level of the particular animal and the way they would speak. So just a very short snippet of what you can do putting yourself in another character's point of view. We also had an 8th grader win a contest this year, putting herself in the point of view of a passenger on the Mayflower, and just decided to use this speech and character format. And she also, it was for the Daughters of the Revolution, were putting on this history writing contest, and the lady who was judging the contest said she was brought to tears by this 8th grader's writing of this woman who was a passenger on the ship. And so I think students can really bring out emotions and understand feelings in this exercise. What do you think? Any thoughts of characters, or trying to think how science this would apply?
So when you do those in class, do you have them present them in character, sort of?
Yes.
So if they do a person with an accent, you have...
Yeah, they do. They do. They do indeed.
That's something you could do in history, like the biographical monologue, sort of. Even if they're doing the same person, it would be a different presentation.
True.
Interesting.
Based on whose, yeah, whose take it was. What characters can you think of right off the bat that would be a good fit for a speech and character?
About anybody who's studying the Bible. I mean, David.
So many situations.
I mean, we just finished reading about he and Bathsheba's meeting, or Uriah, or
Oh,
yeah.
that would be a good one. Yeah, it's fun to think about options. Okay, the next one we have is the refutation confirmation, which will also be covered by Jenny Carey. I think is another fun one. Taking a narrative and either proving it to be true or proving it to be false. So there are 6 approaches that we could take. We would give that the story is impossible, that there's no way by the laws of nature that could have happened. We could address its improbability, that it's just unlikely that that sort of thing could happen, that it's unclear, that there really just aren't enough, there's not enough information given to make it clear, inconsistent, that details contradict each other, that's inappropriate, that it's maybe not morally acceptable, or it covers actions that we wouldn't want to emulate, and then inexpedient. I kind of take the angle with that it would be unbiblical or ungodly with this one. It's similar to inappropriate, but just not worthy of repeating, or it's not an uplifting story to tell. So I think that Bible stories are great for confirmations, confirming how a story could be true. The story of Jonah and the well. How could that possibly be true? Is it possible? Is it probable? Is it clear? Are the details clear? Are they consistent with what we know about science? And if you do some research, you can really support this well. There's some really good supporting facts out there. So at Christmas time, I have my students take the night before Christmas, and then they refute it. How can this guy be allowed to come in to someone's house and he's smoking and pipe and he's breaking and entering? And so they refute it, and then I have them confirm Luke 2, the Christmas story, the true story. There are lots of narratives that you can use if you want to really have them think about, is this worth promoting? Is this appropriate? Is this expedient? Is this worth retelling and studying and learning about, or is it not? And if you need a resource, Snopes.com. Has anybody ever looked on Snopes.com? It's kind of got fake news or stories that, could this be true? And then there's someone who kind of gives whether or not it's true or false. So you can get some really fun stories off of that website. But if you do some Googling, there's lots of fake news out there that you can use for a resource. But any thoughts on, you could probably take like the theory of evolution or maybe other scientific theories.
You have to kind of tie in apologetics with evolution.
That would work.
Creation.
Mm-hmm.
was wondering
Definitely.
about, I was trying to think about literature, but I was thinking of Greek myths, or reputation, or kind of taking away the camera. Do that.
That'd be really good. Yeah, you could go through the steps pretty easily. Good ideas. Any other thoughts? All right, the commonplace. So, commonplace or common topic. is written to usually assail or condemn a specific vice. It could also be used to praise a virtue, but it's normally taking an evil and really expanding on it and telling why it is so evil. So the process is, after you introduce the vice or the virtue, then you kind of go through some of the same steps as the proverb Crea. You give a contrast, you show the opposite of the vice, you compare it to a worse vice, you explain why someone would engage in this vice. Think of an example from history or literature. So you can kind of start with that sometimes if you're reading about a particular topic and you're seeing evil come out in that topic or story. You can kind of use that to build on. And then you go through rejection of pity. Why you would not want to have pity on anybody engaging in this awful behavior. So, for example, if we were discussing the discrimination of the Jews during the Holocaust, a contrast would be being accepting and loving. And so students can kind of analyze, what is the difference between discriminating or judging and accepting and loving? Well, isn't that applicable to middle schoolers? Comparing it to another sin, maybe murder. Discriminating can be a form of hating someone in your heart. Why is it done? Why do people discriminate? It builds them up. Another example of discrimination would probably be really easy to come up with. James speaks to discrimination, slaves in the South. And then you would go through the different rejection of pity approaches. The description would be to describe the evil in great detail. And that's one that students are really good at doing. The illegality of the evil, tell why it breaks the law. Justice, show that punishment for those who discriminate should be severe. Maybe you could offer some of the natural consequences that happen when we discriminate. Maybe your friendships are limited. Argue for expediency, that swift action should be taken. And honor, show that elimination of the vice will produce honor in an individual person, but also society as a whole. And then practicality, argue that the public desires retribution, how it will bring peace, unity, and godliness to society. So is this one that you could see yourself maybe using? Have you used it? Really?
I have not. I think this one seems cool because you could do, we've got like the classical virtues and the Christian virtues, and you could do that with younger
Perfect.
ages and go through all of those, but then as you get into older ages, you can do the more subtle vices, like why it's wrong to spend so much time on Snapchat or something like that, and you could do a commonplace that's a little more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as clear what necessarily like the contrast
Yes.
is, but they have to
The
come
younger-
up and
yeah.
actually think through that stuff.
The younger students may be more black and white, and then the older they get, there are some gray areas that they could delve into. So
Karen Swallow Pryor, I don't know if you've read that book that she wrote on reading well, and she kind of takes the virtues and talks about reading for virtue and reading all kinds of books, because whether it's vicariously learning virtue through reading about somebody's poor representation of virtues and how you can glean from that and pick up, a good virtue from that, or change of thought of mine. But it's a great book, and it does just that. Yeah.
awesome. Okay, so a couple more in the next few minutes. We end with thesis and legislation, which are actually pretty similar. The thesis presents a person's opinion about an issue of importance, and it's a little different than a little different format than a thesis, like a persuasive thesis paper that students would write, but it goes through the approaches of showing why a certain issue is necessary, possible, advantageous, easy, fitting, lawful, customary, and just. Our students, one year, we have our school building. Since we've run out of room, we have gained ownership of the house across the street and converted it into classrooms, and also we have a couple portables back there. So one year the students decided we should have a tunnel that goes under the school to the house. We don't have to walk across the street, worry about the danger of getting hit by cars, get wet in the rain and the snow. So that was one thing they argued. Should CSW, should we build a tunnel from the house to the school building? But there are plenty of options as far as things worth debating or thinking about or presenting your opinion about. And the legislation is just a little more specific. It's arguing for or against a particular law. So there you can look at rules or laws in literature that are broken, that characters struggle with, or school rules that apply to every student every day. And they can argue for or against and come up with ideas. Phones should or should not be allowed in a classroom. One of Eileen's books deal with, should federal trials be should they be televised? Should they be broadcast on television? I thought that was an interesting thought. But there are so many topics, and students are good at coming up with them on their own, from their own lives, or from what they're studying. I think that, especially in middle school, that wonderful logic stage just comes naturally to them to find something to argue about. For younger students, these last two exercises might not apply as much, but they can still think about laws and rules and why they're set and why we follow them and what happens when we break them.
How is it, you said it's not really persuasive?
It's not, it doesn't follow the same format as like a thesis, you know, with the, like if we would take the, have proofs, like, you know, start with the narratio, have specific proofs and organized paragraphs. It's basically following those 6.
Is that done in first person too? Because it says a person's opinion, so are they...
Right. Those last 2 can be done from a first person point of view. Those last 2 can be. So that would be another way it would, I guess a thesis would be too, so. Thoughts on the thesis or legislation at all?
These were, my son has been
Oh.
in this class, and he came home last year and wrote a paper about why he should not be required to go to bed by a certain time. And he included...
On his own, right?
...research, and he followed the, I mean, he presented it to me and his dad, and it has internet citations and research documents, and
Was he successful?
Yeah. No.
Did he did not achieve his goal?
No. But it was interesting to me that he took the time to do, and he knew how to do it because he had done it in school. So.
He knew the thought process to attack or to...
He did a very good effort.
Did he include a refutation?
Yeah, he did. I mean, he had scientific studies cited and everything. Yeah, Dr. So-and-so did a study.
Well, we just have 5 minutes, and I don't want to miss the opportunity of giving Katrina and Macy a chance to speak up about the Progymnasmata.
I mean, what do you want to know?
So why don't you share your favorite exercise and why?
Okay. I enjoyed the Encomium because at our school we do these things called G2Gs, where every morning we have devotionals before school, before we come to class. And last year, every Thursday, we'd have these things called G2Gs where our principal would put pens on a chair, and it's a chance to encourage somebody in front of everybody else. And they would go up there, say something kind about them. He would usually give us a verse to base it off of. And then we would basically give them an encomium.
Wow, just on the spot, right there.
Yes. But then when we learned encomium in class, we had to write a paper about someone in our class and then give a G2G that was formally written. And that was just kind of things. We had a thesis 3 points about the person that we were trying to encourage in front of everybody. And so then that made doing G2Gs on the spot a lot easier.
Because you knew
Because
things
we
that you
knew
could.
kind of a basis of what it should look like. And that's probably my favorite one.
Nice.
So I haven't done all of the exercises, but of the ones that I have done, description is probably one of my favorites because all throughout freshman year we write memoirs and rhetoric, and they're just literally like 1 hour of your life, and it's just our teacher trying to have us look at life differently and what we learn from the situation. And a big thing she always says is show, don't tell. And in order to do that, you have to implement description. And writing this description and learning like the formal way to write description, I don't know if you could say that, it definitely helped make writing those memoirs a lot easier.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing. Awesome. Well, I've talked about this a little bit with Mr. Snyder and other teachers at our school, very well educated in the Progymnasmata, and we just decided you don't really need a curriculum. If you have these approaches, you can just give it a go. I mean, it's very helpful to have a curriculum which gives you more specifics and you can really understand and grasp each part of the process, but this is really all you need to go from. And it reminds me of Elaine Selby's quote when I was learning spell to write and read, and she said, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. And that, I don't have any of you heard her say that? It's just stuck with me. Like, this is worth doing, whether it's like you're the most brilliant person on earth doing it and reaching every student, or you're just taking a stab at it, and it's just worth doing because it's really good material. So I will leave you on that note. Did you have one more question?
Yes, I was wondering if at one point of the curriculum you make the students write, I suppose it begins even in the middle school, but writing about literature, literary analysis. At our school, it's a discussion that's ongoing, and we're trying to make our students improve on that, write intelligently and talk intelligently about the books that we read. So it's a completely different exercise. Does that cover what you do at all? Because, I mean, with our students, when they go to college, they're going to have to write about literature.
Well, all of these formats would apply to, I mean, you could easily apply them to anything you're reading. You could compare, take two concepts, compare. You could...
Literary analysis is very specific.
Okay, like actually analyzing...
Yeah, passages or, writing about a book that we've read.
So what would be the format for that you, like, is there a specific format that you use, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be a passage in a book, right? Explain what's going on here. What do you make of what the writer or the character is saying here? What does that say about the character? So it's commenting the text, critical analysis on the text, which I think is a very important skill to have in our students.
Yeah, I think all of these would enable you to analyze literature in certain ways, and maybe not. I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Our school is dealing with a similar issue.
Yeah.
We use lost tools in 7th and 8th grade, level 1, 2, and soon 3. But high school literature teachers are having that conversation about the lack of ability to analyze critically text. I mean, they're primarily schooled on how to write a persuasive or judicial address.
But they need to be able to look at something and
so
analyze
I
it.
think what we're learning is someone who has a specific end goal in mind is needing to then teach the students what it is they want them to do. So it's just another teacher who teaches literature, but also wants to evaluate writing, giving them instruction on what they specifically want.
Right. It's the
Yes.
literature essay, right? It's an essay about literature.
Right. Which I think could be done through these.
It's hard.
But I agree with you. I think
It can be
could
done
be
through these
through
in
any
different
one of
ways.
those.
It's just maybe not a specific way that's normally done. It's just in very different.
Yeah, or they could at least help you get to that point. I mean, even just like developing the skill for description can help you then analyze, why are these the words that the author chose to describe a, so one of the exercises that I did with our 9th graders was they had to take the 2-paragraph description of Frankenstein's monster from Frankenstein. They had pulled out and they had to rewrite it, keeping everything except for the strong adjectives and verbs. And